The evening was quiet, and the city streets were buzzing softly with the usual rush of people heading home. Cars honked occasionally, and the distant murmur of conversations filled the air. On one corner, by a small cafe that many people didn't even notice, a man sat quietly at an old piano. It was the kind of piano that had seen better days. The wood was chipped, the keys were slightly uneven, and a few notes sounded a little flat. Yet to him it didn't matter. He ran his fingers lightly across the keys, feeling the familiar texture beneath them. For years, this had been the only thing that made him feel alive. He was a man who had lived many different lives in his time. Once he had performed in music halls, small bars, and even a few local festivals. People had clapped, smiled, and cheered. Music had been everything to him. It was the reason he woke up every morning, the reason he had hope. But life, as it sometimes does, had a way of taking things away. Slowly, first came the loss of his job, then the loss of his apartment, and eventually he found himself walking the streets, invisible to most people. Tonight was no different from many other nights. He was tired, hungry, and weary from the constant struggle of just surviving. But as he sat by the piano, he felt a small spark inside him, a faint reminder of the joy that music once gave him. He closed his eyes, imagining an audience, imagining applause, imagining the way music could make people feel alive even for a moment. Most people walked past without noticing him. Some hurried by, late for work or meetings. Others were too busy staring at their phones to even glance up. It was as if he were invisible, a ghost among the living. He had grown used to it. Years of being overlooked had taught him not to expect anything from anyone. Then, unexpectedly, someone stopped. A young woman had entered the cafe and noticed him sitting there. She paused, her eyes resting on his hands as they hovered over the keys. There was a gentle curiosity in her gaze. She didn't know him. She didn't know anything about his life. Yet something about the scene made her hesitate and then smile softly. "Excuse me," she said, stepping closer. Her voice was polite, almost shy. "Could you play just one song?" The words surprised him. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to him, let alone asked something like that. He hesitated, unsure of what to do. He looked at the woman and then at the piano. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he had the energy or courage to play, but there was something in her eyes, a quiet hope, a gentle expectation, that stirred something deep inside him. Slowly, he nodded. "Just one song?" he asked softly, almost to himself. "Yes," she said. "Just one, please." It felt strange to be asked something so simple, something so human after all these years. But he took a deep breath, lowered his hands onto the keys and pressed the first note. It was soft, almost tentative, like a whisper. The sound filled the small cafe, and for the first time in years he felt seen. He began to play. The melody started quietly, simple and unassuming, but gradually it grew richer, more confident. Every note seemed to carry a story, of lost dreams, hard nights, small victories, and forgotten joys. The woman stayed near the piano, watching him carefully, and slowly, the sound began to catch the attention of others. People walking past the cafe window paused. Some turned around, drawn by the unexpected beauty of the music. Others opened the door quietly, entering the cafe to listen. What had started as a simple request, just one song, was beginning to change the energy of the place. The ordinary, routine evening had transformed into something special. He didn't notice most of the audience at first. He was lost in the music, lost in the feeling of his fingers moving over the keys, feeling the vibrations and listening to the melody take shape. It had been so long since he had played in front of anyone that he had almost forgotten what it felt like. But as the notes flowed, he remembered every moment of joy he had once felt playing for an audience. He remembered the applause, the smiles, and the way music could make people feel alive. The crowd grew slowly. A few strangers had stopped at the doorway, then more followed. Some stood quietly in the back, watching, listening, feeling something they couldn't quite explain. Others whispered to each other, amazed at the beauty of the music and surprised that it was coming from someone who looked so ordinary, so unnoticed. The man played for a long time. The one song turned into several melodies, each different from the last. Some were soft and gentle, carrying a sense of sadness. Others were bright and lively, making people tap their feet or sway slightly. The cafe had become alive in a way it hadn't been for years, all because someone had simply asked for a song. People who had been rushing past on their way home now lingered. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The music spoke for him. And as they listened, many of them felt emotions they hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of peace, a sense of connection, a reminder that there was beauty in the world even in unexpected places. When he finally paused, he looked up and saw the woman still standing near the piano, smiling. "Thank you," she said softly. "That was beautiful." He nodded quietly. "I'm glad you asked," he said. For the first time in a long while, he felt a warmth in his chest, a sense that he mattered, if only for a moment. The crowd clapped softly, then more loudly until the cafe was filled with genuine, heartfelt applause. Some people wiped tears from their eyes. Others just smiled quietly, touched by the experience. He realized that this small, simple interaction, someone asking him to play just one song, had made an enormous difference. Not just for them, but for him. That night, after everyone had left, he sat alone at the piano, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and joy. He thought about how small gestures could change everything. How one person's curiosity, one small request could bring a forgotten life back to light. The city outside continued to hum, but in that small cafe corner he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He closed his eyes, letting the last notes linger in his mind. He realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. Not fame, not recognition, but something far more important. A reminder that even when life had been hard, even when it had felt like no one was paying attention, a single act of human connection could awaken hope again. And so he made a promise to himself. He would play, he would share his music whenever someone asked, whenever he could. Because sometimes all it took was just one song to remind people, and himself, that life could still be beautiful. The city streets were quiet that night, but the music lingered in the air, floating out into the world, touching hearts in ways the man could never have imagined. And for the first time in a long while, he slept with a small smile on his face, knowing that tomorrow someone else might ask for just one song, and he would be ready. The next morning, the man woke up to the soft light of the sun peeking through a crack in his small room. The city outside was stirring, cars starting their engines, people rushing by, yet he felt unusually calm. Last night's music lingered in his mind. The way he had played, the way people had stopped to listen, the small applause that had warmed his heart. It had been years since he felt that kind of joy. He stretched and rubbed his hands together, feeling the chill of the early morning air. For a moment he thought about skipping the piano today. After all, it was just another day, and who knew if anyone would even come to listen again. But then he remembered the woman who had asked him for that one song. Her eyes, full of hope, had been so sincere. Somehow that small moment had awakened something in him. He couldn't ignore it. He dressed quickly, putting on the only jacket he owned, slightly worn but clean, and made his way to the cafe. The streets were busier now, the usual hum of the city filling the air. Yet as he approached the corner where the piano sat, he felt a strange anticipation. Something told him today might be different. When he arrived, the cafe owner was already outside, unlocking the door. "Back again, I see," the owner said with a warm smile. "People have been asking about you since yesterday. Seems like your music made quite an impression." The man nodded quietly, unsure of what to say. He didn't feel like a star or even important. He was just someone who loved to play music. But there was a small thrill in knowing that people remembered him. He sat at the piano, his fingers brushing over the keys. The instrument felt familiar, comforting, almost like an old friend. At first he played softly, testing the notes, letting the sound flow gently into the morning air. Then slowly the music grew richer. Melodies poured from him, full of emotion, full of life. He played as he had always played, not for money, not for attention, but because it felt necessary, because the music had always been a part of him. People walking by began to notice. A man with a briefcase paused mid-step. A young woman stopped with her shopping bags, and a child tugged at their parent's hand, eyes wide with curiosity. Slowly, more people stopped to listen, drawn in by the music. They didn't know his story yet, but they could feel the honesty in every note, the years of experience, the deep emotion that flowed naturally from his fingers. The cafe owner brought him a cup of coffee. "For you," he said kindly. "You'll need it if you're going to play all morning." The man nodded and smiled faintly. "Thank you," he said. The warmth of the drink spread through his hands, and he felt more alive than he had in years. As he continued to play, the crowd grew. Passers-by stopped to watch, some lifting their phones to record the moment. People who had walked by hundreds of times before now lingered, captivated by the music. Some whispered to each other, amazed at the beauty of what they were hearing. Others just stood silently, letting the melodies wash over them. A little boy sat cross-legged on the pavement near the piano, eyes fixed on the man's hands as they moved gracefully across the keys. He had never seen anything like it before. His mother watched from behind him, smiling. "He's amazing," she whispered softly. The man didn't notice most of the crowd. He was lost in the music, letting the notes carry him. The world outside seemed to fade away. For the first time in years, he felt free. The worries of hunger, cold nights, and the uncertainty of life didn't vanish entirely. But in that moment, they didn't matter. What mattered was the music, the connection, and the small miracle of being heard again. An elderly woman approached and dropped a few coins into the tip jar on the piano. "Thank you for playing," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I haven't heard music like this in years." The man nodded quietly, grateful but not needing to say much. He continued playing, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Every note was a step back into a life he thought he had lost. Every melody was a reminder that, even after the hardest times, beauty could still exist. By midday, a small crowd had gathered outside the cafe. Some people had come because they had heard about him from others. Some had stumbled upon him by accident, but all of them were captivated. Some were smiling, some had tears in their eyes, and some simply stood in awe. One man in a suit approached him, holding a small business card. "Sir," he said politely, "I work for a local music organization. We've seen your performance, and we'd love to feature you in a small concert we're organizing. Would you be interested?" The man blinked, unsure what to say. A concert for him? He had never imagined anything like this. After a moment, he nodded slowly. I'd be honored," he said quietly. The man left, walking back to the piano, and continued to play. The crowd, sensing something special, began to grow even more attentive. Cameras were raised, and a few people started filming, sharing the moment online. The music that had once been for himself, for a fleeting sense of freedom, was now reaching far beyond the street, touching people he had never met. Later, as the sun began to set, a young journalist arrived. She introduced herself and asked if she could interview him. "Your story is beautiful," she said. "People need to hear it. They need to know that even someone who seems invisible can create something extraordinary." The man was hesitant at first. He wasn't used to talking about his life. The streets had taught him to be cautious, to survive quietly. But something about her kindness made him agree. He spoke softly, telling her about his past, the music halls, the lost opportunities, the streets, and how he had almost forgotten the joy of playing. She listened intently, nodding as he spoke. When the interview ended, she thanked him warmly. "I think people are going to be amazed," she said. "You'll touch so many lives with your music and your story." That evening, when he returned home, he felt a strange sense of fulfillment. The day had started like any other, but it had transformed into something extraordinary. He had been invisible for so long, and yet here he was being noticed, appreciated, and even asked to share his music on a larger stage. As he sat alone in his small room, he picked up a pen and scribbled a few notes on paper. Melodies, ideas, and rhythms that had lived only in his mind now flowed onto the page. For the first time in years, he felt hope, not just for today, but for tomorrow. The next morning, he returned to the cafe piano with renewed energy. The crowd had started to expect him, and many people came early, hoping to hear him play again. Children, tourists, and locals all gathered, eager to witness the magic of the music. The cafe itself felt alive, transformed by the simple act of one person asking for just one song. He realized something important that day. Sometimes, it only takes a small gesture, a single request, a moment of curiosity, to change someone's life. For him, that one request had awakened something long buried, something he thought he had lost forever. And now, he could share it with others. The sun began to set, painting the city in warm hues of orange and pink. As he played the final song of the day, he looked up at the crowd and smiled softly. They didn't know his entire story yet, but they could feel the truth in the music, the struggles, the losses, the joy, and the hope. When the last note faded, the applause was immediate. People clapped, some cheered, Some simply whispered, "Thank you." The man felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't fame or recognition that mattered. It was connection, the knowledge that someone had cared enough to ask for just one song, and that his music could touch hearts again. That night, as he lay down to sleep, he thought about the possibilities ahead. Invitations, opportunities, and attention were starting to appear, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never stop playing. No matter what happened, he would continue to share his music, because he had learned something profound, that even the smallest acts of kindness and curiosity could spark miracles. He closed his eyes, letting the melodies of the day echo in his mind. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to play, another chance to connect, and for the first time in a long time, he slept with a small smile on his face, feeling alive again. The next morning arrived with a gentle chill in the air. The man woke up feeling something he hadn't felt in years: excitement. Not the kind of excitement born from expectation or pressure, but the quiet, steady thrill that comes from knowing that something meaningful is beginning. Yesterday had been extraordinary. People had stopped, listened, and for the first time in years he felt seen. Today he was determined to play again, to let the music reach more hearts and to discover where this new chapter might lead. He dressed quickly, brushing his worn jacket over his shoulders. The streets were already busy with early commuters, cyclists, and delivery trucks making their rounds. He walked to the cafe, carrying with him nothing but his small bundle of belongings and his ever-present determination to play. As he approached, he noticed something different. There were already people waiting. A few tourists, a mother with her child, and even some familiar faces from yesterday's crowd. They had come early, hoping to catch the first notes of his music. The cafe owner waved at him warmly. "Looks like word got out," he said. "People are lining up to hear you today." The man smiled faintly, feeling both nervous and grateful. "I'll do my best," he replied softly. He sat down at the piano and let his fingers hover over the keys. For a moment he closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, remembering all the nights he had spent on the streets, the loneliness, the fear, and the cold. But in that moment he also remembered the music, the one thing that had always remained his friend, his comfort, and his lifeline. He pressed the first key. The sound was rich, resonant, carrying through the cafe and spilling onto the sidewalk. People outside paused, heads turning to listen. The music began slowly, each note deliberate, telling a story without words. Passers-by stopped, unable to resist the pull of the melody. Some leaned against lampposts, some sat on benches, and a few stood frozen, caught by the beauty of the sound. The man lost himself in the music, and the crowd around him grew. Tourists lifted their phones to record. Children watched with wide eyes, and strangers whispered to each other, marveling at the talent that seemed to appear out of nowhere. He played not to impress or to gain recognition, but because the music was part of him, and it was demanding to be shared. Suddenly, a small girl approached, holding a tiny bouquet of wildflowers she had picked from the park nearby. "For you," she said shyly, extending them toward him. The man's eyes softened, and he reached out to accept them. "Thank you," he said, touched. "That's very kind of you." The crowd watched quietly, sensing the tenderness of the moment. It wasn't just music they were witnessing. It was humanity, a reminder of simple kindness and connection that often goes unnoticed in the rush of everyday life. As the day wore on, more people gathered. Some had heard about him through social media, where videos of yesterday's performance had started to spread. Others had been drawn simply by curiosity, intrigued by the crowd and the music that seemed to flow effortlessly from his hands. Before long, the small cafe corner felt like the heart of the city, filled with a shared sense of awe and wonder. During a brief pause, a young man stepped forward nervously. "Excuse me," he said, "I work for a local music foundation. We saw the video of your performance online. We'd love to invite you to play at a small event we're organizing. It's a charity concert, and we think your story would inspire everyone." The man was silent for a moment, unsure if he was ready. Public events, crowds, cameras, these were new to him. He had spent years unnoticed, and now suddenly people wanted him to play for an even bigger audience. But as he looked around at the people gathered, at the expressions of wonder, joy, and even tears on their faces, he realized something. This wasn't about fear or recognition. This was about sharing something meaningful. He nodded slowly. I would be honored," he said. The young man's face lit up. We'll send the details. Thank you, he said, and walked back into the crowd. After he resumed playing, the music seemed to take on a new energy. Every note carried more emotion, more depth, as if the knowledge of an upcoming opportunity had unlocked something inside him. People listened silently, captivated by the beauty and sincerity of each melody. Some closed their eyes, letting themselves be carried away by the music, while others whispered to each other about how moving it was to see someone share their passion so freely. As the afternoon sun began to lower, casting golden light over the cafe and the street, an elderly woman approached. She had a gentle smile and eyes that shone with a quiet warmth. "Your music reminds me of my husband," she said softly. "He played piano too, but I haven't heard someone play like that in years. Thank you for sharing this with us." The man felt a lump in his throat. He nodded, accepting her words gratefully. It wasn't just praise. It was a connection, a bridge between lives, a recognition that his music had the power to touch hearts in ways beyond words. Before long, a small film crew arrived. A reporter had heard about the man from someone who had recorded a snippet of his performance and shared it online. They wanted to capture his story to share it with a wider audience. He agreed, though hesitantly. Cameras and microphones were intimidating, but he reminded himself that this wasn't about fame. It was about sharing music and inspiring others. The crew set up quickly, and he played for them first softly, then allowing his emotions to flow freely. Every note carried the story of his life, the struggles, the long nights on the streets, the moments of despair, and the sudden glimmers of hope. The journalists watched in awe, some quietly wiping away tears. They could feel, even through the camera, the raw honesty in his performance. When he finished, the crowd applauded once more. People who had never met him before now felt a personal connection. They approached to shake his hand, leave small gifts, or simply whisper their gratitude. The man felt overwhelmed, but in a quiet, steady way. It wasn't fame or recognition he craved. It was the knowledge that his music had made a difference, even if only for a few people that day. As evening approached, the cafe began to empty, but a few people lingered, unwilling to leave the music behind. The man stayed seated, playing one last melody as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the streets with warm hues of orange and gold. It was a song of gratitude, of hope, of beginnings. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years he felt alive. Later that night, as he walked back to his small room, he thought about all that had happened. In just a few days, life had shifted in ways he could never have predicted. A simple request, "Just one song, please," had opened a door to something greater. He had been invisible, unnoticed, and now people were stopping to listen, to watch, and to care. He realized something profound. Sometimes the world only needs a small spark to change everything. One person's curiosity, one act of kindness, one small request. These could ignite a series of events that could transform a life completely. As he lay down that night, he felt a quiet determination settle in his heart. Tomorrow he would return to the cafe. He would play, not for fame, not for attention, but because the music was part of him, because he could touch lives, and because he now understood the incredible power of one small act. For the first time in years, he drifted into sleep with a sense of peace. The city hummed softly outside, but within him, there was a quiet joy. He had survived the streets, he had endured hardship, and now, he was beginning to reclaim a life filled with purpose, connection, and the magic of music. And somewhere, deep inside, he knew that this was only the beginning. The days following the street performances passed in a whirlwind of music, attention, and small but meaningful opportunities. The man had never imagined that a simple request, "Just one song, please," could turn his world upside down. Yet here he was, recognized by strangers, filmed by journalists, and approached by people who wanted to share his story with the wider world. Still, he remained humble. Fame wasn't what he sought. All he wanted was to play, to share his music, and to touch lives one note at a time. One morning, as he walked toward the cafe piano, he noticed something remarkable. People were already waiting. The small crowd that had formed over the past few days was larger than ever. Children, parents, tourists, and even some of the same faces from earlier performances had gathered, eager to hear him play. Some carried cameras or phones hoping to capture the music, while others simply stood, silent, letting the sound wash over them. He sat down and placed his hands on the keys. For a moment he closed his eyes, letting the memories of the past week swirl through his mind. The woman's simple request, the small crowd gathering, the unexpected attention. He took a deep breath and began to play. The notes floated softly at first, then grew into rich, flowing melodies that carried both joy and melancholy. Every note told a story, one that no words could fully express. People listened intently. Some tapped their feet, some hummed along quietly, and some simply closed their eyes, letting the music speak directly to their hearts. The man played longer than usual, caught in a rare moment where the music seemed to play itself. It was as if the piano and he had become one, and the world around them faded away. Suddenly, a familiar face appeared in the crowd, a young woman who had been the first to ask for just one song. She smiled warmly and gave a small wave. He nodded in recognition, a silent thank you passing between them. It had been her simple request that had sparked all of this, and he couldn't help but feel grateful for her curiosity and kindness. As the day progressed, more people arrived. Word of his performances had spread quickly online, through social media, videos, and news articles. Some people had come from hours away just to hear him play. Others brought small gifts, a cup of coffee, a snack, or even a handwritten note thanking him for the music. Every gesture reminded him that even small acts of connection could have a powerful impact. A man approached him cautiously, holding a folder filled with papers. "Sir," he said, "I work with a local music organization. We've been following your story, and we'd love to help you perform at a bigger venue, a charity event. Hundreds of people will be there. We think your story could inspire them." The man felt a mixture of surprise, nervousness, and excitement. A big venue, hundreds of people. It was far beyond anything he had imagined. Yet when he looked at the small crowd still gathered around the piano, he realized that the fear didn't matter. This wasn't about pressure or recognition. It was about music, about sharing something meaningful. I would like that," he said softly. Plans moved quickly. The charity event organizers were kind and understanding, making sure he felt comfortable. They explained every detail, from the stage setup to the microphones and lighting, assuring him that his music would shine no matter what. For someone who had spent years performing alone on the streets, this level of preparation was both overwhelming and reassuring. Meanwhile, the street performances continued. Each day, more people came, drawn by the music and the story behind it. Some had been touched by his playing, some had been inspired by the story circulating online, and some simply wanted to see what the excitement was about. The man began to notice familiar faces returning. The little boy who had sat cross-legged on the pavement, the elderly woman who had shared memories of her late husband, and even people who had been strangers only days before. They all came for one reason: to listen, to feel, and to connect. One afternoon as he played, a young journalist approached again, notebook in hand. "I've been following your journey," she said. "Would you be willing to share more of your story? People are fascinated by how someone who has struggled so much can still create such beauty. They want to know how you found hope again." The man hesitated. Talking about his past was never easy. The streets had taught him to guard his heart, to survive quietly. But he also understood that his story could help someone else, someone who was lost, forgotten, or struggling. And so he began to speak, sharing pieces of his life. The music halls he had once performed in, the nights he spent sleeping on cold streets, and the loneliness that had almost swallowed him. He spoke about the small moments of kindness, the people who had stopped to listen, and how a single request had reminded him that life could still be beautiful. The journalist listened carefully, nodding and occasionally jotting down notes. When the interview was complete, she thanked him sincerely. "Your story will inspire so many people," she said. "It's proof that even when life seems impossible, hope can return." The man returned to the piano and began to play again. But now the music carried a new energy, a sense of purpose, a depth that came from realizing that his journey could inspire others. Each note felt deliberate, each melody infused with the knowledge that something meaningful was happening. The audience felt it too. People watched in silence, captivated by the sincerity and emotion of the performance. Days later, the charity event arrived. The man stepped onto a small stage in a hall filled with hundreds of attendees. The bright lights, the microphones, the crowd, and it was all new, overwhelming even. But when he placed his hands on the piano keys and pressed the first note, everything else faded away. The music flowed naturally, carrying the story of his life, the struggles and the triumphs straight to the hearts of those listening. By the end of his performance, the applause was deafening. People rose to their feet, cheering and clapping. Some wiped tears from their eyes. The man smiled quietly, bowing his head. For him, it wasn't the recognition or applause that mattered. It was the knowledge that music could reach people, heal them and inspire them to keep going even in difficult times. After the event, invitations started arriving to play at schools, community centers, and even music festivals. People wanted him not just for his talent, but for the story behind the music, a story of resilience, hope, and the power of a single act of kindness. Despite the growing attention, he remained grounded. Each day, he returned to the street piano, teaching children who wanted to learn, sharing melodies with strangers, and helping others who were struggling. Fame and recognition were secondary. The true reward was the connections he made, the moments when someone's eyes lit up at a note, or when someone whispered quietly, "Thank you." One evening, as he walked home from the cafe, he paused to look at the city skyline. The lights reflected in the river, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of peace. He had survived the streets, endured hardship, and found a second chance. Not through luck alone, but through music, persistence, and the kindness of others. He realized that life could change in an instant. One small act, one simple request, "We're just one song, please," had opened doors he never imagined. And while the journey was far from over, he now knew that hope was possible, even in the darkest of times. That night, as he lay down to sleep, he felt gratitude swelling in his heart. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just surviving, he was living. And he understood that no matter what came next, music would always be his guide, his companion, and his way of connecting with the world.